My name is Emily O'Neill, and I'm here to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is intellectual freedom. It is probably one of the things I'm most passionate about, so if that comes across in the presentation, you'll realize how important this topic is to me. Why that is the case? So the first is that I am the technical services manager here at Deschutes Public Library. And a lot of people don't really know what technical services means. It's very much a library land jargon, but it's basically the department that buys all of the library materials. So everything that you check out, whether it's an ebook or a magazine or a DVD or a regular book, kids, adults, teens, all of that material comes through a department, and that's called technical services. Within that team, we have 3 collection development librarians who are all Masters of Library Science librarians, dedicated to purchasing the materials that you all check out and upholding your information rights. We also have a team of, they're called technical services specialists, and they are catalogers and acquisition folks who get that material into the online catalog so that you can search for that and find it. So there is an entire team that is behind the curtains getting your materials to you, and that's the group that I have the joy of getting to manage here. The other part of that, as I mentioned, is within collection development, one thing that folks ask often is, there's millions of books that are published every single year, and how do you decide what to buy? How do you know what goes into this collection? So just for some perspective, our collection size is about 270,000 items. So if millions of books are published every single year, and our entire collection is 270,000 items, we have to be a little discerning about what it is that we purchase and what are the materials that are coming into our collection. And we do that using intellectual freedom and our collection development policy. And the policy tells us things like, we're a popular lending library, we're not an archive. And so we're here to support the popular and immediate information needs of the community. If you're needing archival information, that's what our historical societies and our academic libraries are here for. So we have guidelines that help us collect those materials. And that leads to intellectual freedom. So we need to make sure that when we purchase materials and support our community's information needs, that content is content neutral, and that we aren't making judgments on what information needs somebody would want or need. And that has led me to become the chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee, provided to you through the Oregon Library Association. And my role with that is really to help libraries as they prepare so that they are more equipped if a library challenge were to come. So to help them draft their collection development policies, for example, and looking at other things that help them stay in alignment with their intellectual freedom needs of their communities. I'm also there to help them as they experience challenges that come to them through their communities and how to work their way through a challenge experience. And then finally, we help report that information back to the state so that we can get statistics on what materials are being challenged and really what the state of the situation is across the state of Oregon. So I'm going to talk to you about all of those things in the next hour or so, and then I'll save about a half an hour at the end for any questions that you might have. Before I dive in, one thing that's really important is libraries are tied to intellectual freedom through First Amendment rights. And so I'll be talking about the law quite a bit in this presentation. And one thing that you have to say when you talk about the law is whether or not you are a lawyer. So I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. So if you need legal advice, I recommend you find a practicing attorney that can help guide you through your legal needs. This is guidance as a professional librarian. So what is intellectual freedom exactly? Intellectual freedom, the definition of it is that it's your freedom to encompass, hold, receive, and disseminate ideas without restriction. It's an integral component to your democratic society, and it gives you your right to access and explore, consider, and express ideas and information as a basis of your self-governing, well-informed society. So that's a lot of words. And the way that I like to describe it, most simply put, is to reverse engineer those two words. It is the freedom to your own intellect. And so what that means is it's your chance to decide what is true for yourself. It is your chance to ingest information that is valuable to you and to you alone. It's how you learn, and it's how you express what it is that you have learned. So broken down, it's your freedom of thought. It's your freedom of expression. It's your freedom of independent thinking. And this is something that is protected to you as individuals under the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. So we're going to talk about the Constitution a little bit and how exactly it is tied. So a history lesson. Within the United States Constitution, there are the Bill of Rights. And those Bill of Rights, there were 10 additional Bill of Rights at the time that the Constitution was ratified. Those came to us because the signers would not sign the Constitution without that Bill of Rights added. And the thought behind it is that there are certain rights to an individual in their humanness that should be protected at all costs. So these are considered your civil rights. If you've heard that term as well, the Bill of Rights is your civil rights. And the intention is to say these are rights that are yours and given to you at birth because you're a human being in this country. So it's important to realize that as you look at those Bill of Rights, because sometimes people will say, well, the Constitution protects you against the government. What does it have to do with your rights? And specifically, the Bill of Rights is to protect your humanness. The other thing that's really interesting with the law is that they put things in order for a reason. So when they created the Bill of Rights, they specifically put a number of rights under the First Amendment. And the thought was that these are primary. The word first means something. And we're saying these are the primary, most important things that we need to protect as a society in the United States. As we're creating this country, these are the most important things to us to protect for our citizens. And under the First Amendment, there's a variety of things. You'll see freedom of religion, you'll see freedom of the press, and you'll see freedom of speech. And it's specifically under freedom of speech that libraries are attached to that Constitution. So how, right? A lot of people say, wait, but freedom of speech has nothing to do with freedom to read. How are these connected? Why are these the same thing? And, well, the law does that for us too. So over the hundreds of years that have happened since the Constitution was ratified, people challenge what it means to have freedom of speech. And they take cases to a court of law. And through the court of law, decisions are made. And through those decisions, precedent is created. And so little by little, we chip away at what the definition means for each of these rights through these court proceedings that have happened over hundreds of years at this point. And ultimately, through all of these court proceedings, the courts have held that freedom of speech includes informed thought. And in order to have informed thought, you have to have freedom of information. So in order to have your ability to speak, you have to be informed. In order to have your ability to be informed, you have to have access to that information. And that's ultimately how libraries have become this cornerstone of the protection of your freedom of speech under the First Amendment. So the court case that is most commonly cited at this point in time is from 1992, and it's Kramer versus the Bureau of Police in the town of Morrison. And the judge ruling gave the court opinion of freedom of speech includes the right to receive speech, and likewise that libraries are the quintessential locus of the receipt of information. And that's ultimately where libraries are now immediately tied to your rights under the Constitution and part of what it is to be a citizen in the United States today. So that's pretty lofty for libraries. That's a pretty big ask. And to say that we are the locus of all of the information, when I mentioned earlier, millions of books are published every year, our buildings aren't growing. So how do we determine how we're protecting your freedom of speech when we can't possibly provide every single information point that exists in the world today. And so the law has helped us with some of that. So the first thing is we want to, again, take a step back to what it is to be attached to the Constitution as an institution. So back when the Constitution was created, we only really had one public forum, and that's called a traditional public forum. And at the time, that was really, truly when, your governor at the time, the President of the United States, George Washington, gets on a stage in the, city plaza and talks to you and you talk to them. And it's immediate access to your lawmakers, and it's an open place where anybody can say anything. You're open, and it's just really a free moment in time for you to have any discourse that you want. So today, traditional public forums do still exist. You don't get to just call the president now. That's not how that works. But we do have places where you can say whatever it is that you want to say. And those places are like Drake Park. It's a park where you can do a protest if you would like. You have to fill out a form, but you can do a protest in Drake Park and you can say pretty much whatever you want to say. That's an open traditional public forum. There's also limited public forums, which is what a library is. So a limited public forum means that there are restrictions you have to put in place so that you can do the job that you are asked to do. So for us, in order to be able to give you access to the information that is required to us by law, we have to put some rules in place so that we can do our jobs as librarians. And those rules have to be one of three things. They have to be a time, place, or manner restriction. So I didn't say content restriction. We don't get to do content restrictions. We can do time, place, and manner restrictions. So what time, place, and manner restrictions mean is that, for example, the library is not open 24 hours a day. We are open from 9 to 6, 9 to 9, depending on which branch and what day of the week it is. And that's because we have staff who also have laws that we have to abide by as far as giving them work-life balance and being able to sleep and eat and go home. So we don't have unlimited resources to keep this building open 24 hours a day. So we are allowed to do a time restriction and say that the library is only open from this time to this time. We're allowed to do place restrictions. So for example, you as members of our community are not allowed in the staff areas of the library. And that's because we have a lot of stuff we are doing back there. I mentioned, my department, tech services, we sometimes have 60 boxes coming in that we have to unload. We have carts and carts of materials that we need to check in and reshelve. And we can't have members of the public coming in and, being in the space that we need to be in order to get that material back out to the shelf so that you have access to your information. So that would be considered a place restriction. And we can do manner restrictions. So manner restrictions are things like what is happening around you as individuals would impact your right to the information that you seek. So for example, if somebody is blaring a boombox in the adult nonfiction when you're trying to do research, that's a noise restriction. It's manner, right? Because you have a right to get your materials without having a boombox blaring while you're trying to read and do research. So we can say things like you can't, there's noise parameters in the library so that you have your rights. But at no point can we do a content restriction. And that's really what things are being asked to happen when people ask to challenge books, is that it's a content-based restriction. And we can't do that under the First Amendment. So through all of that, we have a parent organization. It's called the American Library Association. And the American Library Association also provides us with some guiding principles to be able to, again, fulfill this very lofty requirement of libraries to uphold your First Amendment rights to information. The first document that they give us is called the Library Bill of Rights. And within the Library Bill of Rights, they provide a number of guiding principles that libraries follow across the country. There's 10 of them total. I didn't list them all here. They are on future slides. I'm not going to go through them all because it's not a really long document, and it's probably something worth reading if you're interested in intellectual freedom. But the ones I want to cover here is within the Bill of Rights, we have a requirement to provide materials to all. So we're not here to say that we can provide materials to just one type of person or another type of person. If you are a citizen in the United States, or if you're in the United States, we have a right to give you the information that you seek. It is for everyone. And I want to clarify that one more time. It's for everyone, regardless of how old you are. And that has been a big concern as we've gone through book challenges, is that there's a protection of children, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But your rights are not something that you age into, and we'll talk into that a little bit more. Materials represent all points of view. And this one can be really hard because we all come to the table with our own worldviews and our own perspectives and our own biases. And I mentioned my team. We have 3 collection development librarians, and I'm sure they have things that they believe in and that they don't believe in. And how do they purchase equally and evenly so that all points of view are represented? And again, that's where we have a collection development policy that has objective criteria as to what it is that we buy. There are no subjective criteria as to what it is that we buy. We also make sure that when we have a moment when our collection development team is unsure about a topic, that we come together as a team and look at that policy collectively so that it's not just one person that's making that determination. We're here to challenge censorship, which is what I'm here talking to you about today, and we do regularly within our role here at Deschutes Public Library. Is we're very active in intellectual freedom, and protecting against censorship is paramount to me. We're open to all, which can be really hard, right? Because one thing that we notice as our communities are changing, especially our community here in Bend and Central Oregon, is that, for example, we have an increase in our folks that don't have homes, and they have information access rights as well. This is a place that anybody can come to. And so it is a place where we welcome all members of our community, regardless of what they come to us with, what their demographics are, what their backgrounds are, what their socioeconomic is. This is a place where everybody can come. Our meeting rooms and exhibit spaces are open to all equally. So a lot of times people talk about intellectual freedom as it applies just to the books, but it applies to everything that this library is. You have access to this meeting room. You have access to our displays. You have access to our bulletin boards. They are all things that need to be protected under time, place, and manner restrictions, not under content restrictions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And then we're here to protect your confidentiality and your privacy. We don't track what you read. It's one of those things that sometimes people wish we would, because they want to say, oh, that book I read 6 months ago, what was it? And we don't know. That's not something that we keep. It's not something that we track. It is something you can track if you want to. In BiblioCommons, there is actually a setting that you can put in that says, track my reading history, and that's for you alone. We don't have access to that. We can't get into that. And that's so that you can feel free and open to read whatever you want to read and research whatever you want to read, research without feeling like, oh, the librarians are going to notice. And we don't do that. We're not going to do that. And we're very, very aware of your privacy rights with everything that you check out. So rest assured, we're not paying attention to what it is that you get, and you can check out whatever you want regardless. So here are the Bill of Rights. Again, I'm not going to read through them all, but they're available to you on the ALA website. They also provide us with another document, and this one's much longer, but again, it's really interesting, and if you have time, I would recommend you take a look. And it's called the Freedom to Read, and then they also made an additional Freedom to View statement. And I'm going to read through these because they're a little poignant. There are a couple moments where you say, is that true? Is that real? And it is true, and it is real, and these are the guiding principles that we as a library believe in. So the first is that we trust Americans to make their own choices in what they choose to read and watch. So we aren't going to tell you what to check out. We aren't going to tell you what to read. We aren't going to tell you what is or is not within your own personal worldview, what's within your own personal interests. We will give you recommendations, and we love to do that. Reader's advisory is one of our favorite things to do. So we will give you so many recommendations, but we won't say this is the only book that you should check out. This is the only book that you should read, or you have to read this. That is not going to be something we will do. So we are here to guide you, but the ultimate choice on what you check out and what you watch falls solely within yourself as an individual. We trust, this one's really fun after COVID, but we trust Americans to recognize propaganda and misinformation. So what that means is that, again, as a collection development team, we have to realize that sometimes, especially with our most controversial topics, there are two sides to this. There are two different ways of looking at it. And we don't get to say whether you're right or whether you're wrong. And that can be a big source of book challenges because people are really passionate about the things that they believe in. So for example, we will have books that will talk about, the COVID-19 vaccines and why you should get them. And we will also have books about anti-vaxxing because it is not our role to tell you what is true and what is not. And it's also not our role to decide why you would check that out. I'll tell you, one of my favorite things to do ever of all time is to check out books I don't agree with, just because I want to know what they're saying. I want to know what the other side says. So I have to give you the right to check it out and to do that research and to have that thought without judgment. And so you will find things that you don't agree with. And maybe that's a good chance to check it out because you might learn a little bit more about the thing that you're obviously so passionate about. We do not believe Americans would sacrifice their right to press or information in an exchange of a protected worldview. So we are not here to be your protectors. We're not here to create a world that is a perfect bubble of society. We are here to say that we believe you want the full truth and you get to decide what to do with that. And so we're not going to stop you from negative information. We're not going to stop you from hurtful information. We're here to say all information has a value at some level, and it's up to you to decide whether or not you want to ingest that or not. We believe that Americans favor free enterprise of ideas and expressions. Yes, we're an opinionated group. And so we want to make sure that you can express yourself and have those ideas regardless of what they are. And the last one, and I mentioned I would come back to this, we defend the constitutional rights of all individuals, including children and teens, to library resources. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the Bill of Rights and your civil rights, and I said those are your rights as human beings. Those are not your rights when you become an 18-year-old human being. Those are not your rights when you're a certain level of education human being. Those are your rights as a human being in this country. And that means that you have them from the day you were born until the day you pass. And in some cases past that, because we're still going to protect your privacy and confidentiality even after you've left. And so what that means is that we do check out materials to children as they have an information need as well. There aren't books that are only restricted to kids versus adults. Kids have full access to everything in this building, just like every other individual. And the only person that can decide what that child checks out is that person's, that child's legal guardian. We don't get to say. That legal guardian gets to help guide those reading decisions. And we'll talk about that a little bit more right here. So there's a legal doctrine that public libraries in particular have to follow, and it's called in loco parentis. And it says the role of librarian is to advise and assist users in selecting information resources. Parents and only parents have the right and responsibility to restrict their own children's access and only their own child's access to library resources, including the internet. Librarians do not serve in loco parentis. So one of the things that's happening quite a bit in our book challenges is this idea of this protected worldview, which we just said we don't believe in, for children in particular, which we are not here to guide the reading and viewing habits of children. Only their legal guardian can do that. And so that is something that comes up, is that as a society, people say they want to protect all of the children. And what a beautiful thought. But people are different, and they have different thoughts, they have different opinions, they have different worldviews, and their family has different information needs, and they have different guidances that they need for their own children, and it is up to that family unit to make those decisions. It is not up to one individual to say what is helpful, what is not helpful, what is harmful, what is not harmful, what is important, what is not important. Only that family unit can do that for their own child. So this is a lot of information, and it's really hard for libraries, right? Like, you can start to see how heavy it is for us to make sure that we try and give you all of the information that you could possibly want, knowing that we have limits to the size of our building, to our resources, to all of those things. So ALA also helps us with that through the Bill of Rights. And they have a website here called the Interpretation of Bill of Rights. And it gets through about 30 different scenarios of like, what about this? Like, what about the internet? Or what about rating systems? Or what about labels? So if you have one of those what about questions, I encourage you to go look at the interpretations, and it will help you understand what the legal guidance is to libraries in that particular scenario. So we're finally to what is censorship? So that's another big question that has come up. A lot of times when people hear the term Banned Books Week, which we're about to celebrate the first week of October, is that, well, it's not banning. People say it's not banned because the book still exists on the shelf, or the book still exists in society. It's still being published. And we're not talking particularly about banning. We're talking about the word censorship. And censorship ultimately is the suppression of ideas and information that some individuals, groups, or governments find objectionable or dangerous. It's the restriction of that access to that information. And there are a lot of different ways that you can say you don't have open and equal access to this idea and this thought. And that is ultimately censorship. It's someone else saying what is appropriate for you to ingest versus what was available to you openly before that topic came up. The censor wants to prejudge materials for everyone. It is somebody saying, I don't believe in this, and so nobody else should have access to this in the free form that it was previous to my statement on this topic. And there's a lot of different ways to censor materials. So again, when people say, well, we're not banning things, you still can buy that book at Amazon, so I don't know what the topic is here. Well, again, we're not talking about banning. We're talking about you restricting open and equal access to information, which is protected under the First Amendment right of the United States Constitution. And there are the 5 R's, I like to call them the 5 R's of censorship. These are the 5 main ways that we see censorship happening in our world today. So the first is restriction. So restriction is not saying, well, the library needs to get rid of that book. The restriction is saying, like you can keep it, but would you put it behind the desk? Or you can keep it, but like maybe you need a parent's approval slip for that child to read it. So you're saying that this thing that was readily available before should now be restricted to only certain people, certain ways of access, certain moments in time. And the issue is saying put it behind the desk is, remember how we say your privacy and confidentiality is also important to us? You don't have to go to a librarian and say, I want access to this book. And if that book is nefarious for whatever reason was defined by the censor, you might not feel comfortable asking that librarian to access that book. So now you don't have access to that information because we've created a barrier that makes it less likely for you to get the information that you are seeking. The second is redaction. So this is saying, oh, well, we're not going to get rid of the whole thing, but like, let's just not allow that one page or that one sentence or that one image. Let's just get rid of the bad parts. Who gets to decide A, what the bad parts are, and B, sometimes those are the parts that are the most important to that work. And I don't get a say. It's not my role to say that you don't have access to that one sentence, that one moment in time. The third is relocation. And this happens, again, quite a bit with the challenges that are happening across the country, is that when a book is published, the publisher and the author tell librarians what the intended audience was of that book. So they will say, this is a book that is intended for children the ages 5 to 8, or teenagers the ages 14 to 19, or this is an adult's book. And it is, again, our role and responsibility to follow these guidelines objectively. And so when somebody says, well, you don't need to get rid of that book, but you need to move it from the kids section to the adult section, that item is no longer available to the intended audience. That information has now been lost to the intended audience that it was created for. The next one is relabeling. And we'll talk about some scenarios where this has been encouraged over the last several years. So the issue with relabeling is not that we put labels on books, right? We put a lot of labels on books. We just moved to our new classification system, Wayfinder, and it has a lot of labels on books. And they're topical labels, actually. And so the intention behind those labels, though, is to help you find what you're looking for. The intention is to improve your access. The intention is to say, please go browse this area. This information is so helpful that let me show you exactly what it's about. So a lot of the relabeling is about intentionality. So if your intention is to put a label on a book that says X-rated or adults only or mature content or explicit content, you're putting a label on that is very subjective. So it's not a topical objective label like the one we just described. It's subjective, and it's saying, this is nasty, don't check it out. And so again, it could make someone say, oh, I don't want to check that out, especially because what if you take it home or write it on, or reading the book on the bus or in the doctor's office, and you have this big old sticker on it that says explicit content, you're probably not going to check that book out. So the intention of that label is to say, don't check me out. And that is a restriction on access. And the last is the one that most people talk about when they talk about book banning and censorship, is actually removing the title from the collection. And again, removing the title from the collection itself is censorship, even if you can still buy that item from Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever. And that's because, again, our Bill of Rights say we are a place that is open for all, regardless also of economic status. And so if your only access to that title is now that you have to financially fund your information and you don't have money, you're living on the streets, or you're paying for food, out of, asks from friends and family, you're not going to take the time to buy a book. You're wanting to buy gas. You're wanting to shelter yourself. You're wanting to buy your food and make sure that you're getting through the day. So you actually don't have access to that information if it's not freely available through a library. So this is the scary one. This is the slide where I say, here's the nefarious content that may not be appropriate for everyone. So if you need to step out, then I understand. But I do need to take through what are the restrictions on First Amendment rights to freedom of speech. Because everyone says, well, it's not absolute. You can't just say everything that you want to say, and that is true. And so there are things that we cannot just say, and there are things that would not be appropriate for a library. But again, the law tells us what those are. They are not subjective criteria that somebody gets to come to me and tell me. It needs to go through a court of law that says this is allowed or this is not allowed. And so I'm going to take you through those. So the first one, and this comes up again quite a bit in the book challenges that are happening across the country, is people are saying that the title or the work is obscene. And they're saying, this is obscene, this is terrible, this is pornography, this is, explicit, this is violent, this is all of these things that it shouldn't be, and the library can't have stuff like that. And there is a legal definition to obscenity, and it has to follow what's called the Miller test. So the Miller test is a 3-prong test. And the first thing that you need to know is the work has to adhere to all 3. So it's not it applies to the first part of this test, but it didn't really apply to the other 2. All 3 of these need to be present for an item to be considered obscene through a court of law. The first is that whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that work taken as a whole to be salacious or indecent interest. So the intention on that is everyone in this room would look at that same title and everyone would agree that the entire thing is indecent. That's really hard. I don't think we could get everyone in this room to pick out where to go eat for lunch. And so the idea that the entire community will say that this title that you're saying is obscene is in fact obscene, it would be pretty obvious to all of us that it was in fact obscene. Part 2, because again, it's 3 prongs. So we already said the first one is pretty hard to do. The second one, the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual content, specifically defined by the applicable state law. So I mentioned, well, sometimes people say it's obscene because of violence or language, and actually the Miller test says you can only be obscene if it's about sex, which I find kind of interesting in this society that sex is scarier than violence, but under the Miller test, if it's not about sex, it's not obscene. And the third, whether the work taken as a whole lacks any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So there is no value in this book or work at all. There's nothing literary about it. There's nothing artistic about it. There's nothing scientific about it. There's nothing political about it. So the only thing that I know of that has ever been considered obscene under the court of law was Hustler and Playboy, and that's why we don't carry those at the library. And also, Playboy countered that, and they're actually no longer considered obscene. So it is very difficult to say that something is obscene, and usually it is, in fact, not obscene. And I would say you need to take it through a court of law, and a judge tells us as a library that it's obscene, and then we take it from the shelves. You telling me that it's obscene does not define it as obscene legally by a court of law. The second is child pornography. And again, this is difficult to talk about, but people are saying that this work is child pornography or that it's pornographic. And how could you possibly have this material in a library? But again, the law tells us what is pornographic and what is not. So the legal definition of child pornography is one, that it has to involve a minor, someone under the age of 18. Well, the other part of that is that visual depiction has to be an actual photograph, video, digital image, or underdeveloped film, computer-generated image of an actual child. So it is not an illustration in a graphic novel. It has to be an actual child in an actual photograph. A graphic novel is not child pornography. An illustration is not considered pornography. And so those are the 2 things that we lead to when we talk about the book challenges. Now, there are additional things that you can't say, and I think it's important to flush out the final things that you can't say under the First Amendment right, though these ones maybe don't adhere as much to the book challenges that we're encountering. So the third one is defamation and slander. So you can't openly and knowingly tell lies about other people that will hurt their status in some way. So don't do that. Defamation and slander will get you in trouble with a court of law, both criminally and civilly. The fourth one is called fighting words. And this one actually does come into play in libraries some, especially under the umbrella of hate speech. So to be super clear, hate speech is not a definition by the court of law. There is no definition of hate speech that we have to apply under a library. And that can be really hard because a lot of speech really is very hateful. and is very hurtful. And we as libraries are a place that is open for all. And we don't want somebody to come in and feel like they're being hated on because of the words that are being said. But unfortunately, not yet, at least, there hasn't been a legal definition of hate speech. So we do have to protect sometimes very nasty and ugly words because it is protected under the First Amendment right, at least so far, with the exception of fighting words. So fighting words are words that are intended to enact an immediate and imminent lawless action. So it has to be immediate and it has to be a lawless action. So where this comes into play is this is the one people talk about where you say you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Well, the thought behind that is because people can get trampled trying to leave the movie theater. They will get hurt by the words that you just said, and it's immediate. They're gonna run off those steps. There's gonna be people that can't do the stairs as well, and they could actually get hurt by the words that you said, physically hurt by the words that you said. So unless it's immediate like that, and that somebody could actually genuinely get hurt in some way, physically hurt, those words are protected, at least right now, under the court of law. And the last one is national security under the Patriot Act. So the government can censor anything they want, basically, and under the guise of national security. So welcome to the Patriot Act. So I want to talk a little bit about graphic novels. And I'm not going to read through this entire slide. I believe they're going to get sent out later on. But people will say, well, but graphic novels are different. And I'm here to tell you graphic novels are not different. Graphic novels are still considered a work, a material, and information access point under all definitions of information. So they're actually not any different than the way that we would look at books. And they get attacked in particular for a few reasons. One is that they're visual, right? So like the intention behind that is that you would read something and then have a visual cue next to it. And sometimes those visual cues can be disturbing or can feel like they don't fit the worldview that you live in, or they can feel shocking. And so people will see that visual depiction and say, how could that possibly be allowed? And it is, because it's still a literary work and it's still an information need. The other thing about graphic novels that people don't necessarily understand or recognize in the moment is that graphic novels are one of the best ways that we can help readers become readers if they're reluctant readers. So with that visual cue, what happens is that you have word associations. So if somebody is a reluctant or delayed reader in some way, having that visual cue helps them understand the words that they are reading. It helps make sense. It helps create knowledge and understanding by having that visual cue. It also adds in things like punctuation and grammar. And so not only are you learning to read and comprehension and understanding, you are also learning about structure, right? Like, what does an exclamation point mean? What does a question mark mean? When you have the visual to attach it, you can learn so many things, especially by our readers, that this is not coming naturally. And so in short, it's one of the best ways to help folks that are not inclined to read or are delayed or are uncomfortable or for whatever reason are not having the reading comprehension get to a place where they enjoy reading. So they absolutely have a value, and we do protect them at the same level that we would anything else in this collection. So takeaways is that you cannot restrict access based off of content. You cannot restrict access based off of age. Only a legal guardian can do that. We can set time, place, and manner restrictions. So let's finally talk about what has been happening around this country and around Oregon when it comes to book challenges. So the first thing is that why am I even here today? Why is this important? Well, this content is protected under your First Amendment rights. So I don't want the library district to get sued. That's like the big takeaway, is that people are asking, well, how are they getting away with it? And they're not. Their states, districts, communities, libraries, school libraries, they are getting sued. And they're getting sued. I mean, this is just a small collection of links to lawsuits that are happening to these districts, to these libraries, to these communities when they are trying to restrict access. And that is very expensive. It's not a good look, and we're not going to win. The Constitution has been protecting these rights since it was enacted. And the reality is we don't need to go down that road when we know legally this information is protected under your rights. So we have what is getting challenged. People ask, what are the issues? What is coming up? So the American Library Association annually puts out a list of the top 10 most challenged books. This list came out, oh, I have a typo here. This is the 2023 list. This came out in April, and you can tell it's not the top 10, it's actually the top 13 most challenged books this year because of a number of ties. But the common theme is that every single book that has been challenged, not every single, the vast majority of the books that have been challenged over the last 2 years have been one of two themes. They're either content about race or content about gay, lesbian, transgender, or non-heterosexual relationships. The writing on the wall is that our demographics that are not the majority in our country are the ones that are getting attacked in our book challenges. It's not one worldview that is saying, well, I as an individual don't agree with this book content. It is a concerted effort to say that there are certain members of our community that are not welcome. And it is organized. It is happening at a mass scale, and it's happening through many extreme organizations. There's no reason why every single book on this list should be only 2 topics. And that's because it's being driven by organized groups across the country. And you can see it in the rise in censorship that has happened since 2020. So it has gone up from an average usually 200 to 300. Last year was almost 2,000. This year was over 2,500. We're probably going to be well over 3,000 this next year. And again, almost all of it is about 2 members of our community that we're saying is not welcome. Information about your life is not available. We don't want to read what it feels like to be Black in this country. We don't want to read what it feels like to be gay in this country. That is inappropriate. That's what's being said through these book challenges. And it's happening here in Oregon. So this came out just last week. So if you saw the news article in the bulletin, it's about the report that came out from the State Library of Oregon. Has a Office of Intellectual Freedom, and they track the challenges that happen here in Oregon every year. And they report back annual statistics. So within the last year, there were 46 individual challenges that were reported to the state. And out of those 46, 93 titles. So you can see the math a little bit on that, which is that oftentimes it's not one book that is getting challenged, it's multiple. They're saying all of the materials that are on this topic are inappropriate. So again, how do you know whether or not that book has any value if you're saying the entire topic is inappropriate? How do you know if you could learn more about that if you're not even looking at them? You're challenging them en masse. You're saying this topic is something that I don't believe in. And why do you get to say that this topic is inappropriate for the entire community? And they're mostly happening at public libraries, which is interesting because nationwide, it's also happening a lot at schools. So here in Oregon, I think maybe our public libraries are just better at reporting than our school libraries, because I would say that it's, as the chair of the Intellectual Freedom Committee, we help a lot of schools through these challenges. And so something to know about the statistics, these are just the ones that are reported to the state. Again, we are well aware of challenges that never got reported. And that's either because they didn't know the importance of reporting, they feel fearful of, impact to, ricochet back to them of what it would look like to be reported on. They just want it to be done. And so we often are not seeing people report that should on the challenges that are happening across Oregon. And so who challenges materials? Oftentimes we think it's just the one parent, like the parent of the one child of the material that is being in question, or the one customer that read the one book that they are, not comfortable with. And typically before the big wave of challenges, that would be the case. It would be a customer that came across a book or a title or a movie or something that they were uncomfortable with and they were challenging on their own behalf. But that is not what is happening currently. We do have that happen, but the majority of our challenges are complaining about something on somebody else's behalf. So a parent is complaining on the behalf of their child and usually all of the children. A community member is challenging something on behalf of the entire community. An administrator is challenging on behalf of their entire constituents. So they're challenging not for themselves, but they're saying, like, I'm here to represent the entire community, and so you need to listen to me. And that, again, is not appropriate. Not one person in our community, including our elected officials, get to tell you what your information need is. So this one I found interesting. This came up just today. So one of, as you saw from the top 10 most challenged books, the author of Genderqueer, the #1 most challenged book in the last 2 to 3 years, they wrote the graphic novel Genderqueer, wrote an additional graphic novel, which I found very poignant on what it feels like to go through a book banning experience. So like, what a great way to work your way through the situation. It's not a full graphic novel, honestly. I just read it and it's like maybe 3 pages. But it is a little bit of a fun way to say, I saw this happening. But they wrote this slide, which is true data from the Washington Post. And the Washington Post reported back in May of 2023 that nearly out of 1,000 challenges, 60% of them were submitted by 11 people. And that's when I say it is a concerted effort, it is an organized effort that is making these challenges. So 11 people are responsible for 92 challenges. One man alone, was responsible for 92 challenges. And these 11 people are what is dictating this entire thing. And again, they tend to be leaders of extreme organizations that are saying, we are trying to control the information need of the country. And I don't think anybody in this room wants 11 people controlling the information needs of the entire country, especially because we don't even know who those 11 people are. So again, if you feel like that information is valuable to you or anybody you know, I would fight back on these book challenges. I would say, I don't agree, because I don't agree with 11 people saying what I get to read, and I don't think anybody else would either. So if you want to stay current on what's been happening, the American Library Association does have an intellectual freedom blog, and you can't read these because there's so many of them. I pulled this screenshot from this week's blog, and every single week there's this many links to challenges that are happening across the country. These are all new, and this is every single week. So when we say libraries are under attack, they are under attack. It is happening in hundreds of libraries across the country every single day by 11 people. So what is happening here in Oregon? I'm going to talk about some of the situations I am aware of that I've helped libraries through, largely just to let you know we're not immune. I think sometimes we feel like as Oregon, we tend to be more open to the thoughts of others. We tend to be more open to the differences of our friends and our neighbors and our community, but that's not always the case. And so we'll talk about and some of these, as you can see, this one of the examples, Seattle Public Library is the Pacific Northwest, but the rest of them are Oregon specific. So way back when I first started talking, I mentioned it's not just about the books, and it's not just about the books. People do challenge books, and a lot of the challenges that we were talking about really were book specific, but that's not always the case. Oftentimes people will challenge displays. So they'll, for example, pride displays are one of the most common things that gets challenged is how could you possibly promote pride? That is a concern that comes up and is one of the more common situations that libraries have to manage. They also challenge what about your internet filtering? Why can't I have access to whatever website it is that I'm looking for on your internet browsers? And so the two examples I'm going to talk about here is Klamath County and programs. So this has been happening over the summer in Klamath County, which feels very close to home. So Klamath County Public Library had a book club that they had been running for a long time. I want to say it was like a couple of years. And the title of that book club was called the Social Justice Book Club. And for a long time, nobody had any concerns about the Social Justice Book Club until the book that they chose in the spring was titled No More Police. And one of their county commissioners is the former chief of police. So the county commissioner called up the library and said, shut it down, and had proceeded to cease access to both that book club, but actually any political programs. So the county commissioner his stance on this situation is that library employees are paid by tax dollars, and therefore tax dollar officials should not be supporting politics one way or another. And by facilitating this social justice book club, you're endorsing political speech, and that is illegal. And so no library staff can be a part of any sort of political program in the library. What is not true about that line of thinking is that political endorsement is specifically tied, A, to elections, and B, you say so-and-so needs to vote for so-and-so. You're actually telling them, go vote for Joe Schmo, he's the best. Having a conversation about politics is not endorsement. Supporting a conversation about politics is not endorsement. As a matter of fact, ALA, if you rewind back again to a previous slide, has, under the interpretations of Bill of Rights, a whole slide on what it means to have politics in libraries. And they specifically say libraries are the place that you talk about politics. It is one of the only places that you can go to talk openly and freely about politics and to learn from your neighbors in a safe and neutral place. Currently, they're working on a programs policy that will hopefully help to address what politics in libraries mean and what library staff and can and cannot do. They are at the point now of moving forward with their social justice book club, but being facilitated by volunteers, which actually is okay. As long as you still have access to that information, it doesn't really matter who's facilitating it. Rural libraries all over the country use their volunteers at an extensive level because oftentimes those libraries have only one person. So as IFC, we're okay with the volunteers. We're not okay with the idea that you can't have the program. So another example comes from Seattle. This was a few years ago, but it's a really important example, I think, to share. So I mentioned earlier that access to meeting rooms is also part of your intellectual freedom rights. So this room that you're in right now, you're allowed to book as community members. And you're allowed to, basically do whatever you want in this room as long as it fits our time, place, and manner restrictions. We don't care, frankly, what you say or do in this room. When you book it as a citizen and you say, I'm going to come in and I'm going to, do my knitting club, or we're going to do, yoga, or we're going to do whatever. Our restrictions are time, place, and manner. So you probably can't be too loud. Again, that's a place restriction because the library is right outside the wall, and that would have an impact on the other users. We don't want you to be too messy because you might destroy the room, and then therefore others can't be in here, and that would have access to their rights. But if you come in here and say, I want to do a very radical political event. As long as you fit our time, place, and manner restrictions and our code of conduct, you're allowed to be in here. And that's exactly what happened in Seattle. There was a radical feminist group that had booked their meeting room. And by radical feminists, what that really means is that they are an anti-transgender group. And the Seattle community was really upset about that. And they said, how could you possibly support this group? And we are not supporting anybody that books this meeting room. You have open access to it, and it has nothing to do with content. And Seattle had to allow that group to use it because it was their information right to do so. Again, hate speech is not defined. And whether we agree with it or not, they get to have access to this meeting room. So this one happened in Crook County. So this happened just about 9 months, well, about a year ago is really when it started. Ultimately, the abridged version, which is very long, and there's a lot of bulletin articles, so you can go back and do some research if you need to. But there was a parent that had come across LGBTQ, so lesbian, transgender, gay, queer materials in the children's section of the library. And they were very concerned because it didn't fit their worldview. And so rather than say, my child is not allowed to read this because it doesn't fit our household's worldview, this parent said, we need to remove all of this content from the library. It in full this should not exist. So then that parent went and talked to the then library director, and they actually recanted on the idea of removing entirely. And they said, okay, we're not asking to get rid of everything, but we need to label it. We just need to label it so there's a warning so that parents that don't agree with it know what not to check out. But we just talked about label systems and said a restricted label system is an infringement on your rights. If the intention of the label is to say, don't check me out, that is still censorship. That is still just as bad as removing it entirely. And on that particular topic, just as an example, let's say an individual did need that material. Let's say they were wondering about their own gender and felt the need to check materials out. And it had a big old sticker that said LGBTQ on it, and they went home to their house. Let's say their house wasn't very welcoming of that topic. What if they got hurt? What if they got, like it was dangerous for them to walk around with a book with that sticker on it? You know, we can't do that because it would interfere with the access to that information, whether you agree with it or not. And so that debate went in front of the Crook County Library on December of 2022. And in that board meeting, they did decide to uphold the intellectual freedom needs of their community. The materials still exist in the library, and there are no labels on their materials as of yet. I do think that the person that initiated these concerns is still looking at ways to restrict access, but currently Crook County is still upholding the needs of their community. Here's some places that aren't. So I mentioned book challenges are happening in public libraries, but they're also happening in schools. So both of these examples are true removal of content. So the content is not at all available to the students at these two districts. So the first one is the graphic novel version of The Handmaid's Tale in Medford Heights School. So this happened over a year ago, about a year and a half ago. And one of the tactics that is happening within book challenges is they're avoiding the challenge process. So I haven't actually talked about how do you challenge book. So just like everything else, we have objective processes. And that's also not just for us to have process and policy in place, but that's to protect everyone. That's to protect those that are challenging the materials, to know that we are being objective and are applying the same criteria every single time it happens. But it also protects us, because if you were to come back and say that was a subjective opinion, we can say, well, we have precedent. We have run through this process the same way for the last 10 years and come to the same conclusion using the same assessment criteria in the same way. So how could we possibly have been subjective in this moment? So it's a bit of a legal protection to libraries. And these challengers know that. And they're just avoiding the process altogether. And they're going to immediately directly to administrators. They're going to library directors, they're going to boards, they're going to school administrators, and they're saying, I'm not gonna bother with this process, but you, who I elected, and I have pull in my community and I can get you unelected, you better remove this book now. And that is what happens. So with the graphic novel version of The Handmaid's Tale in Medford, they went directly to the administrators, and the administrators removed the title. And there's been no recourse since. The Intellectual Freedom Committee, has sent a number of letters to the administrators to ask what was their process, what is their policy, what is the status of this book. And not only do we not hear back from them, but it's our understanding that they are continuing their practices with who knows how many additional titles. So the other thing that happens is, again, members of the community will go directly to school boards. So what happened in Canby is that there were 2 parents that went to the school board and were incredibly aggressive in their request to remove materials. And the school board immediately removed all 36 titles. So the next school board, they got over 200 signatures asking for those books to be returned, and they did not. They did come back and say, well, they'll go through a review process. It was too many, so we removed the books, and they're going to go through a review process, and we'll come back at a later date, which is great that the books are going to go through a review process, but until that review happens, you've lost access to that content. You are still censoring that material for however long the materials are not on the shelf. You have still infringed on the rights of those students. So you should review books, but the books need to remain on the shelves while you are doing the review process. You're not to remove the books during the review process. It's kind of along the lines of innocent until proven guilty. So you're gonna continue to allow access until otherwise noted. So over the summer, Canby did go through a review process. Of course, it's summer, and so we have not, the books have not been brought to an official board meeting yet this school year. So we're hoping that with updated elections that happened over the summer, we might be able to have some more pull and get these books back on the shelves, but currently these are not available within school communities around Oregon. So the last example that I want to share, so people ask, again, is it just the parents, or where are these challenges coming from? And I've given a lot of examples of ways that it wasn't just a parent, it wasn't just a customer. And one thing you should know is there's 3% teachers and librarians on this list. So as teachers and librarians, we have a professionalism that we are expected to uphold. We have masters in library science, but we are also people, right? Like, we also have things that we feel uncomfortable with, and sometimes we come across those, and sometimes they show up in challenge reports. So I'm not surprised that there is a subset of librarians that feel the need to challenge materials. And one example where this happened is with Dr. Seuss. So Dr. Seuss had 5 books. This happened, I want to say it was about 2 or 3 years ago, had 5 books that the estate of Dr. Seuss decided to no longer publish. And it's important to notice the estate of Dr. Seuss, right? So that is a private corporation that can do whatever they want. They can sell whatever they want. They can choose to sell or not sell at whatever level they want. It is not censorship for a private company to no longer publish a book. If that were true, then every single book that has gone out of print would be censorship, and that's not the case. You can choose to stop publishing for whatever reason you want. So they did choose to stop publishing 5 of the Dr. Seuss titles. Now, the reason why it was controversial is the reasoning behind the stop of the publishing of those books, which is that they were deemed racist by the estate, and that they didn't feel like it upheld the Dr. Seuss name and what he created in the world of literacy. And so to help protect Dr. Seuss, who we all love so much, those 5 books went out of publication due to racist content. So libraries were stuck with a question of, do we allow racist content in our libraries? Well, what have I said throughout this entire presentation? We don't get to do content-specific restrictions. So yeah, we have racist materials in this library. And if we were to remove the Dr. Seuss books, we would have to remove Huckleberry Finn. We would have to remove The Scarlet Letter. We would have to remove To Kill a Mockingbird. We would have to remove, depending on what your definition of racism is, probably half of the content. If we were to remove everything sexist, the rest of it would be gone. So we do have things in this collection that you're going to find uncomfortable. And it's not up to us to say whether or not we're allowed to have it, especially if it's a content-based decision and a content-based concern. But libraries did remove some of them across the country, those 5 titles, under their umbrella of equity and diversity and inclusion, which we do care a lot about. And I don't want to say that we don't care. We care a lot. But we need to make sure that we're upholding all members of our community in the ways that we can without infringing on the rights of our users at the same time. And the last one, I mentioned the situation in Crook, and the only reason why I bring it back up is the person that initiated those original concerns, what I left out of the original story is that individual is now on the Crook County Library Board. So she is continuing to pursue restrictions from within the library board itself. And that is another tactic that we see in our elections, is that people are trying to get on what should be a nonpartisan election and push their agenda forward. So I know we just had a special districts election, and I know they're not usually the most interesting and fun, but I would say from here on out, pay a lot of attention to your special districts elections, because it is becoming more partisan and people are finding their way in these special districts through getting actually on the boards and trying to make adjustments within the board itself. Links to the statements, I mentioned we've done statements out to Medford, Crook, and Canby. So if you're interested in the statements that we have put out through the IFC, they are linked on our website. So we have a toolkit that is there. This is mostly intended for libraries. But if you're interested in how libraries do all of this, we have a number of resources on how to respond to a challenge, how to prepare for challenges, and just generally learning more. And if you're interested as a community member, a huge shout out to our CR team, Michael, who's in this room. We have a brand new website that literally rolled out this morning. I'm so excited. It's the Freedom to Read at Deschutes Public Library. It has a presentation that I did on this topic last year for Banned Books Week, and a number of resources just to help you stay up to date on intellectual freedom and how we are doing our best to protect you here at Deschutes Public Library. And now I'm open for questions. So the question was, what is the impact of self-censorship, specifically at school libraries, and how that impacts access and how it intersects with the intellectual freedom? So first off, self-censorship is a big concern across libraries. And actually, I would even, we go beyond that and also call it shadow censorship. So self-censorship is the idea that you won't buy, like, this is all very scary, right? And it is very intimidating. It's very uncomfortable for libraries when they have to go through this. As somebody that helps libraries through it, I cannot tell you how scared a lot of these librarians are. The attacks on librarians are aggressive, they're personal, and people will intimidation tactics like you wouldn't believe on individuals and at the institution. And so people don't want that attention, right? That is not something you're going to ask for. And so there are libraries that will say, I'm going to just step back. Like, I'm just not going to buy those, right? Like, I don't want to deal with all this, so I'm just going to not buy it. And you have a responsibility to buy it. If the content fits your collection development policy, which should be objective criterias, you cannot choose to not buy something just because you're scared of the repercussions. That in and of itself is censorship. You're saying you don't get to have access to this information because of the content, because I'm scared of the impact of it. And so self-censorship is a concern, and we know libraries do it, and we understand why and give empathy, but it is essentially the same as removing the book altogether. You just bypass the discomfort that happens in between. The other thing that happens is what's called shadow censorship. So where somebody will remove the title quietly. So they'll say, oh, well, it was in the collection, but like, oh, I'm seeing all this buzz that's happening about that title, and so I'm just going to go ahead and just remove it. Like, it's fine. Nobody will even know it's gone. And so there's this like nefarious, like kind of backdoor, like, I'll just slightly get it off. And again, the intention behind it, I understand, but it is still censorship. And really the driving factor of what should be in the library collection should be based off of the collection development policy, and every single title, whether you buy it or get rid of it or are reviewing it for a request for reconsideration, should apply the same way every single time to that collection development policy. Yeah. So the question was about the attacks on librarians and kind of the intimidation tactics that I just mentioned, and who is protecting these poor librarians. And unfortunately, there isn't a specific answer to that. So again, a lot of it would depend on the individual institution and how they're structured. So for example, and actually that's not entirely true. Every single library should have what is called a patron code of conduct. And the code of conduct, again, has to be a time, place, and manner restriction, right? So we can't tell someone that they can't be here because we don't like their opinions on things. But we can tell somebody you can't harass our staff. And the reason why is because our staff have a job to do, and that job to do helps you all get your information needs. And so here at Deschutes Public Library, and I would say at a lot of libraries, they should stand up for their staff through their patron code of conduct, which would include, initially approaching that customer and saying the way that you were treating our staff is inappropriate. If they continue, they would lose access to the library. So they would have a restriction to the library for a certain amount of time, and then would be able to petition to come back. That would be probably the first line of defense. The second is we are human beings that have our own rights, and those rights are protected under the law. So I would recommend a lot of these librarians to actually move forward with like a restraining order. Like, you can call the cops and say this person is harassing me, and a cease and desist can and should exist. So again, I think librarians are very scared of moving forward, and maybe there's a thought of, well, I might, be making it worse by asking of this. But if it happened to me, I would absolutely get the person aware that they're violating the code of conduct, and I would get a restraining order. All right, well, thank you all so much. I appreciate you coming.